Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Validating vendor information and checking that they are not on applicable sanctions list is definitely or should be a part of your vendor onboarding process. But what about after the onboarding process? Today's episode is a webinar that not only has a 5-step process for recurring vendor validations, but lots of downloads to help you get started. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 352, Recurring Vendor Validations. Ensure post-onboarding compliance in 5 steps. Now, again, validating vendor information and checking that they are not on any applicable sanctions list is or should be a part of your vendor onboarding process, but you also can't forget about them after that. Number one, many vendors don't inform you of their changes, especially if it does not affect their payments. So you absolutely do need a plan to make sure that your vendor's data stays updated. You definitely don't want to file a reportable vendor with the IRS with a legal name and tax ID that is not valid. And you definitely don't want to have your company be exposed to both civil and criminal penalties from sanctions lists like OFAC if your vendor that when you onboarded them, they were not on the list, but they were subsequently added to the list. So you do need to make sure you're avoiding compliance fines and bad vendor data by ensuring that you are proactively identifying changes to vendors in your vendor master file. Now, what is upcoming will be a webinar, and it will have a 5-step process for recurring or implementing recurring vendor validations. But not only that, if you follow the link in the show notes to this webinar, you can also watch the video if you like. But more importantly, there are 5 downloads that can help you get started on this process. So the first download is, of course, a PDF of the presentation, so you'll have that. Then I also have an IRS W-8 form expiration date tracker, because that's another, recurring vendor validation that you need to perform, because the W-8s, not the W-9s, by the way, but the W-8s do expire. Also, I have a vendor validation reference list with resource links. It has 28 different resources for validations for 18 different validations for your vendor. that you may want to implement. And then I also have a desktop procedure for a new vendor ad. It is for US vendors. It's a template. Now you can take that template and you can uh, duplicate it for non-US vendors, for existing vendor changes. It's really a template that can be used as a base for any procedure that you do as part of the vendor setup and maintenance process. It really does have some great sections that you will use across all of your tasks. So, and then the last thing I have, the fifth one, is global vendor registration numbers. Now, it is an Excel file that you can download, and I will tell you that I usually charge $24.99 for that, but anyone, right, that attended the webinar, in this case, listened to the podcast and followed the link to the webinar, can download it for free along with the 4 other free pieces of content. All right, so without further ado, here is the webinar, and I will see you at the end. We are going to go ahead and get started because we are right at the top of the hour, and I have a lot to get to. I always do. I'm going to try to get you out of here in 30 minutes and give you at least 5 minutes for questions. So we'll see what happens. So welcome to this month's monthly webinar series, Recurring Vendor Validations, so you can ensure post-onboarding compliance in 5 steps. And so we'll talk about 4 things that I know of, at least, that you need to comply with. You may have more depending on your organization, your entity, but these are the 4 big ones. And so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is that on LinkedIn, if you follow hashtag in 5 steps, you will see all of the monthly webinar series posts as soon as they come out, so you can register for either subsequent or upcoming live webinars, or you can watch the recordings from previous webinars from previous months. All right, so let's get the housekeeping items out of the way. This session is being recorded. Tomorrow, this same time, you are going to receive an email with a link to watch the recording if you want to watch it again, or if you maybe want to share it with any of your colleagues. That is a different link for the link for today, because it's the only way that I can attach the handouts to the recording is to create a whole new link. So I always get emails saying the link is different, it's not bringing up anything. It will, if you go through, you do have to register again, which is why I always get all the questions. But make sure you register. You'll get to the recording. You'll get to the handouts as well, especially if you forget to download them. And speaking of handouts, I do have 5 today. So make sure you download those. I'll indicate in purple when we get to the slides what are handouts that are pertaining to that particular slide. But I do have, of course, a PDF of this presentation, but I also have an IRS W-8 form expiration date tracker. So if you didn't know if they expired, you might want to download that. I also have the vendor validation reference list for U.S. and some non-U.S. validations, but then for 100 plus countries, I have either the business tax, individual tax registration number, sales tax registration numbers for 100 plus countries. So make sure you download that. And then I also have a desktop procedure template so that you can see how you can document your vendor processes, and you can copy that as many times as you need it for other functions as well. But at least you have a base template if you don't currently have one now, or want to update your current process, your current desktop procedure format. And then here you can submit your questions anytime. I am going to save it for the Q&A section, which hopefully again will be up to 5 minutes at the end.
Now, a little bit about me. I am Debra Richardson. I used to be a AP senior manager. I was over global vendor setup and maintenance. I had a team of 17, and we processed about 2,000 vendor requests per month. But bigger than that, we maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. That's making sure that we were in compliance, that their information was not stale, that their information was still good. And so that's really what we're talking about today. And that's what I do today. I work with teams like yours to provide training, consulting services, and then also do a bit of speaking. I was in Chicago yesterday. I don't know if any of you were. I told them all about this training, but if it was great to meet you in person. All right, so let's talk about the agenda. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this camera off so I can make sure there are no technical issues so we can get through this as seamless as possible. So let me go ahead and turn that off. All right, so your screen should have gotten a lot bigger. So we're going to talk about first the non-compliance pain points, things that I know that you need to look out for. And then we're going to talk about the 5 steps for recurring vendor validation so you can ensure post-onboarding compliance. So let's talk about the non-compliance pain points. But first, I do have one poll, the only poll, right, of this session or webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and launch it. So I want you to answer the question, how are you validating your supplier registration data? Is that manually? Do you have some type of aggregation tool? Is it an outsourced service? And for anyone that puts outsourced service, I'd love to hear who you are using for an outsourced service for that. But go ahead and select, oh, and I forgot to mention, if you're not doing it at all, you can tell me. It's anonymous, right? No one's going to know who did it. So go ahead and select that as well. So I want to get at least 50%, maybe up to 70% participation. So go ahead, and if you have not cast your vote, tell me how you are validating your supplier registration data. And I emphasize registration here because I know most folks that I talk to, most teams, they know that they need to validate their vendors at onboarding. But most of them will do it then, but they won't do it again unless the vendor, right, has some changes and submits a new W-9, and then of course they'll do an IRS 10 check. But they won't do subsequent validations to make sure that the information is not stale and that it still matches. Some know that they haven't do it, that they do need to do it, and they just don't have the time or the staff. And some are not aware, right? They're not thinking about that. And so that's where this training came from. All right, so thanks everyone. We have 77% voted. I love that. And so hopefully you can see, because I'm supposed to be sharing it, but the results were there were 70% that are doing it manually, 20% are using the aggregation tool. There were none that outsourced, so I guess I can't get any options from that, and that's fine. And then there was only one that's doing it not at all. So the one that's doing it not at all, you might, and everyone that's doing it manually, right, 70%. So that's 80%, right? You make sure you download the handouts because you do have lots of resources to do some validations, no matter what country they're in. Well, some of the countries are format only, but you still get a link to information about that particular registration number. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And so let's talk about some non-compliance pain points. And maybe, you knew about all of these, or maybe there's one that you didn't know about. So we're going to start with the first one, which is the IRS legal name and tax ID combination. So everyone should know that you are always supposed to have, right, valid legal name and tax ID combination that matches IRS records. Because if that vendor happens to be reportable and you file with and it doesn't match, then you're going to get fine and penalties from the IRS. And lots of times, vendors will, for example, send you a change in their banking, and they and not send you an updated W-9, because what are they worried about? They're worried about getting their payments. But what really triggered that change in banking is the fact that they changed their legal name, or the fact that they changed their tax ID. So you do need to make sure you're updating that. And for that matter, if you have a vendor that has a bank change or a remittance address change, ask them for a new W-9. Or it could be, right, that your W-8s have expired and you haven't collected new ones. So W-8s expire the 12/31 of the third year after the signature date. And there's no signature date, then the IRS will let you use the date you received it. But that means that prior to 12/31 of that third year, you're supposed to be reaching out to your vendors and asking for a new W-8. The next one is, of course, the watch list. And this can be OFAC, this can be other watch lists, whatever might be applicable to your company. Everybody knows about OFAC, but there's also things like the Office of Inspector General. They have a LEIE list for those vendors or individuals that cannot, that have been banned from receiving Medicaid or Medicare money. And so if you have received federal funding, or you're in healthcare, that's one you really need to do. So that's watch list. And then the next one is bank branch data. And so you might not think about this, right? And those of you that know NACHA, right? NACHA is the governing body over the ACH network. And so let's say you've got bank branch data in your vendor master file, and your vendor's bank merged or got acquired. That happens more often than you think. When that does happen, it means that the routing number changes. And many times when it happens for ease of use or ease of transition, they do not change the vendor's account number. And so the vendors pay no attention to that. They'll give you an old check with the old routing number on it because the account number is still good, and they didn't forgot about it anyway, right? Or it will change and they don't let you know that the routing number is updated. So you always need to make sure that you're double checking the bank branch data. And when that data is, when that routing number changes, the good news is that you probably have multiple vendors that are using that same bank. And so now you can update multiple vendors at one time. But the problem is that if you don't do that, when you initially send that erroneous routing number in the pay file, it gets to the bank. Your banks may, either your bank or your vendor's bank may change that, right, so that the payment is successful, but they're not going to do that forever. Eventually, you're going to you'll get notice of changes to let you know that they changed it. And if you don't make that change and continue to send those erroneous bank branch details, the routing number, right, in the pay file, then guess what? Then you may be reported, your organization may be reported for a violation, which could cost your company dollars in fines. And then fines, right, are the same thing for each of these. And I know we always talk about or are always apprehensive about IRS fines and penalties, and yes, we should be. But one thing I didn't mention is that the OFAC fines, for example, are much more, right, than the IRS fines are. As a matter of fact, you can be fined if you pay vendors on those exclusion lists or watch lists that are part of OFAC, right? Your company can be fined both civil and criminal penalties. So each of these can cost your company money, and so you want to make sure that you're always compliant. All right, so then again, you need to validate when you're onboarding your vendor, but you also need to validate on a recurring basis, unless you have something like continuous monitoring, which based on the poll, I don't think any of you do. So we're going to talk about how you can implement that recurring validations in 5 steps. And so the first step is, I always have this in here where I talk about validations of vendors, is to make sure you know what countries your vendors are in. And so to those of you that say, hey, I don't have any non-US vendors, right? All my vendors are in the US. Well, I challenge you, go to your accounting system or ERP, pull out these, export these fields, and then identify, look for these things to identify any non-US vendors that you might have, right? So if you have any unpopulated country field, that could be an indication of a non-US country. Any invalid 2-digit or 3-digit state abbreviation, right? So you may see in the state that you have, I don't know, UB or IR or UK, right? Because the person that was entering in the vendor address didn't know how to enter in, right, a non-US address. So check for any invalid state abbreviations. Now, the reason that I asked for the city and state, the city and the address to be exported is because you could have a 2-digit abbreviation of CA, and that could be California or it could be Canada. Now you need, right, the city and or the address to make sure it's one or the other. Also, a U.S. tax ID that starts with a 98. Now, I will say that a few years back, I think it was 2012, it could have been longer than that or another year, but the IRS no longer, right, assigns the first 2 digits of the tax ID with a 98 to indicate that it's a foreign vendor. It's not based on geography or however they did it back then. Doesn't mean, though, that any vendors that obtain their non-US vendors that obtain their tax ID prior to that period, they could still have it. So if you see one that starts with a 98, then double check to see if that is a U.S. vendor or non-U.S. vendor. Also, a tax ID that's not 9 digits, right? So we have a lot of tax IDs out there, vendor registration numbers such as sales tax IDs or sales tax registration numbers, for non-U.S. countries that are not 9 digits. And so if you have one that's not 9 digits, it could be more, it could be less. That could be an indicator that it is a non-U.S. country. And then how about foreign indicators in the vendor name? So we know that anytime we see INC for Inc., that it is a U.S. incorporated company or organization. Well, other countries have their own. And so I didn't include it here because I can really only include 5 handouts, which is why I said 5, but there is a IRS handout that you can download. I think it's IRS Regulation 7701-2. If you Google that, you'll come up with it, and it will have a list of all of the foreign indicators for most countries. So make sure you check that out. And then next, so that's step 1. So that's identifying where your vendors are, because now you're going to have to determine based on country, based on other factors, right, what registration numbers and sanctions lists apply. And so that is where you have the first 2 of the handouts. They're in purple here. And so I have the vendor validation reference list with resource links. And here you will find the resources to validate different registration numbers and sanctions lists. And it's really based or categorized based on where you would get that information. So for registration numbers, for vendor names, right, you'll get those on the IRS W-8, IRS W-9. But I also have some additional information here as well. So we talked about bank branch data. So on the vendor validation reference list, I have, let me see if I can make this a little bigger. I have information or links to where you can you can verify, right, the bank branch routing numbers for the US, for Canada, and if you're non-US, right, the equivalent of the routing number, the BIC code. So this is where you can validate those things. I also have that for the IBAN as well. So make sure you download those so you can identify, right, what resources. You have a list of resources that you can choose from. And then step 3 would be definitely choosing those, because these are the validations that you want to make sure you're doing. You're doing the IRS 10 match. You're doing the watch list validations. You're validating the bank branch numbers. And you're also collecting those W-8s. And so you want to make sure you select your validation resources. And you can use that, the resources I gave you. You may know other ones, but make sure you do a demo. Make sure you review it with your security and IT team. They should have security questions for them before you start using it, and then get approval. And then you want to set up your validation resources, right? Sign up, make sure you have a payment method, do a validation configuration, right? Make sure that it works. If it's a file you have to send, make sure you know what that configuration needs to be, and then test it. And then lastly, make sure you're assigning users, and make sure that you add or you enforce least privilege access. So don't give it access to anyone that really doesn't need to have it, right? Because at that point, you're giving them access to and exposing them to sensitive information that is used, right, for the validations. And then make sure you add it to your security audit. Because you do have login credentials for those assigned users. And then the next one is you want to make sure you document your process for validation so that everybody's doing it. Also, if you document it, guess what? It means that it makes it an auditable process. So you can make sure that your team members continue to do these processes that you put into place to avoid penalties and fines for your company. And so 2 downloads for this one, right? Desktop procedure for a new vendor add. And what I really like about the desktop procedure is that it gives you a table of contents that is clickable. So that's the one that you have that is included in the handout section. And when you click it, it'll go to the specific place. And so in your desktop procedures, make sure you have the process for validations. And so I put the example, and I don't remember what page it's on, but guess what? You don't need the page. Actually, it's on page 9, but you don't need to go to it. You can just click through it. And when you do, you will see that it has the instructions for how to validate the vendor bank data for the wire or ACH routing number. And it looks like I put this on here a couple of times, but I also have the W-8 expiration date tracker. I'm going to go to the next slide because it's bigger, but you can see here that you can input all your vendors' information, including the W-8 sign date. And by the way, I said it before, if you don't have a W-8, if you don't have the sign date, you don't have to send it back to the vendor. The IRS will let you accept the date or put in the date or use the date that you received it. And once you put that in, it will populate and tell you how many days you have until expiration. Now, it's coming up for 12/31. So those of you that are not tracking it, because it's not in, that date is not in a lot of ERPs, you still have time to run a report, get all your non-US vendors loaded in there that you collected W-8 from, and you still have time to determine whether or not, or which vendors you need to collect the W-8 from this year. And then the last step is to assign someone to do it and then set up a schedule for recurring validation. So you have, I always recommend that you have one person and a backup. If you have multiple ERPs, do the same thing for each ERP. Now, I recommend that you do this monthly, but I do recognize that for most of you, this is a manual process. However, I will say that on the vendor validation reference list, there are some vendors out there, third-party providers that will let you do bulk uploads. You all know the IRS 10 match, or should know, right, will let you do a bulk upload. But if you use someone like TinCheck, which is on that list, 10check.com will let you do a bulk upload for not only IRS 10 match, but when you do the IRS 10 match, it also does a check of the watch list. So now you've got 2 for 1 with that one resource. Yes, it does cost a bit more, but it doesn't cost as much as having someone key in right individually into the free search tool to verify that someone's not on the watch list. That may take forever. Bulk upload files take about 3 or 4 hours. There's also a third-party provider on there called Smarty, and Smarty will do the same thing, allow a bulk upload for all of your addresses. And you know you want to do that before 1099s, 1042s come around, because you don't want to send them all out and then have them all come back because you don't have them formatted correctly. But anyway, monthly is best practice, and I say that mostly because of the watch list, because you are not supposed to pay vendors that are on those watch lists. And if you think about it, how often do you have pay cycles? So technically, you should be doing that watch list check before you send those payments out. Many of you don't have the ability to do that, but monthly is the next best thing. Now, if you can't do it monthly, do it quarterly. Can't do it quarterly, do it semi-annually. If you can't do it semi-annually, do it annually. But I will tell you, now you have to ask these questions, right? Have you paid vendors on the sanctions list, right? Which each of those timelines, because now so much time has passed. Plus, if anything has changed, you likely, right, can't get the vendor. You don't have any more leverage to get like an updated W-9, right? Because they've already been paid. So you want to make sure that you're doing this on a recurring basis. Assign it, assign a backup, and then put it on a schedule. So here are the 5 steps. Identify the vendor countries, determine what registration numbers and sanctions apply, set up resources for validations and assign users, document the process for validation so everybody knows how to do it, and then assign and set up a schedule for recurring validations. Now, if you are not familiar with the Vendor Process Training Center, you can get a free account, and there are 3 free training sessions. One is on an 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. That's really great, part of what we went over today. And then I have one on plugging up the gaps in your vendor master file. And then the other one is on authentication, so you know whether or not you're communicating with your vendor or internal team member or a fraudster. All right, so I want to thank everyone for attending today. Again, tomorrow you are going to get a link to a new recording where you can share that with anyone you think that might enjoy this information or find value in it. They'll also be able to, and you can too, download any handouts that you might not have downloaded today. So thanks everyone. This training or this webinar is ending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks everyone.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Again, make sure that you follow the link in the show notes so you can get the 5 downloads, including the global vendor registration numbers. That is typically a paid item, but you can get it for no cost. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 352nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.